and I will turn the mic over.
Good afternoon and welcome on this nice, cool August day. It's amazing that we made it here to begin with, but we have a mixture of people in the audience today. And so the thought was to start with the Ehlers-Danlos Society awareness video that they put together called It's Our Time. And there's a few faces in the room that you will see actually made the video. So it's just a great way to start. And if you're interested, the music that's on there is actually available through iTunes. And so you can download it and the proceeds do go to Ehlers-Danlos. So it's a short video, but it's a great way to start us off.
You're inside out, I'm outside in. You wear your doubt for me on your perfect skin. Why don't you ever believe me? When will you ever just see? Why don't you ever believe me? Why won't you ever just see?
34 years. 26 years.
6 years.
21 years.
69 years.
22 years.
40 years and 7 months.
5 years.
41 years.
25 years. 7 years.
1 year and 8 months.
23 years and 4 months.
Mama, it says mesh.
51 years, 2 months.
13 years.
30 years.
Take away my pain, heal all my bones, run with me through the pouring rain, be my stepping stones. Someday you're gonna believe me. Someday now you're gonna see. Someday you're gonna believe me. Someday now you're gonna see.
20 years and 11 months.
20 years.
10 years.
18 years.
Dauert jetzt 45 Jahre.
7 years.
40 years.
23 years.
24 years.
4 years.
Dysautonomia.
25 years.
18 years.
28 years.
7.5 years.
13 years. 16 years.
20 years.
42 years. 17 years. 27 years.
42 years.
14 and a half years.
2 years. 28 Jahre.
5 years.
24 anos.
7 years.
30 years. 16 years. 35 years.
33 years. 16 years.
10 years.
8 years and 3 months.
4 years. 49 years.
57 years.
32 years.
26 years.
44 years.
21 years. 6 months.
27 years.
53 años.
30 years. 8 years. 38 years.
31 years.
30 years.
49 years.
57 years.
28 years.
12 years.
24 years.
2 years.
26 years. 40 years.
5 years.
52 years.
34 years and 10 months.
4 years, 10 months.
This I promise you.
What a great job they did. So that's been the wonderful awareness video that the Ehlers-Danlos Society has put together to help show how difficult it is. And as many of you know, often that what comes with Ehlers-Danlos is some form of dysautonomia, whether it be POTS or orthostatic intolerance or all of those other ones. And we are very fortunate today to have Lauren Stiles, who's the president and co-founder of Dysautonomia International. And she's going to take a few minutes to talk to us about Ehlers-Danlos, about dysautonomia, about maybe the links, about maybe the treatments and all that kind of good stuff. So Lauren, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really wanted to thank Lisa for inviting me and the Long Island EDS support group and Dr. Tigay. And I'm so excited that Long Island has an EDS clinic now. And I really think it's going to be great for our patients in this region and probably throughout the country. I am the president and co-founder of Dysautonomia International. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We happen to be based on Long Island. But we have a regional office down in DC, and we have volunteers all over the world who have different types of dysautonomia. So I didn't know what our audience would be today, if it would be a lot of medical students or newly diagnosed patients or really experienced patients who know more than their doctors. So I tried to make a presentation that might be interesting to all those different types of people. So we'll get started. So first, what is dysautonomia? So I want to start off by saying dysautonomia itself is not a specific diagnosis. So if your doctor says to you, you have dysautonomia, your job is to say what kind of dysautonomia and where is it in my body and how severe is it? Dysautonomia is like an umbrella term, like cancer. There's hundreds of different types of cancer, and there's probably just as many different types of dysautonomia. So right now, this comes from a textbook on neurology, and the autonomic disorders can be divided up into sort of disease-based, which means we know what's causing it, or we think we know what's causing it, and syndromic. And being on the syndrome side doesn't mean that it's not real or that it's not just as serious, but it just means we don't really understand the mechanism that's causing the autonomic dysfunction. And as you'll see on the syndrome list, there are a lot of diagnoses on there that probably sound familiar from the EDS community, and there's a lot of overlap between the syndromic types. I have POTS highlighted in black because that's the type I'm going to speak the most about today. And as you see, there's a little dashed line that goes between POTS and small fiber neuropathies. So we know that half of POTS patients actually have a small fiber neuropathy. And POTS, and maybe some of the other syndromes, are sort of on their way to becoming more understood. And eventually, if the research keeps progressing, they'll end up on the disease side of the column, but they're just not there yet. So how rare or how common are autonomic disorders? Like most people, I had never heard of this stuff before I was diagnosed with it. If you don't sort of hang out in the chronic illness world, you wouldn't know about EDS or POTS or all these other diagnoses we learn about. So most people think that they're pretty rare because they've never heard of them, but it turns out autonomic disorders are really common. This is a really conservative estimate of just a few of the different types of dysautonomia. Some of them are primary autonomic disorders where the dysautonomia is the main part of the illness, like multiple system atrophy or POTS. But other types of dysautonomia are secondary to another underlying disease, like multiple sclerosis or Sjogren's syndrome. So just this really rough, very conservative estimate, about 41 million Americans, 42 million Americans living with just one of these types of dysautonomia. And there's plenty of other types that we didn't add to the list. So just in general, if you're talking to friends and, once you have one of these type of diagnoses like EDS or dysautonomia, people come to you with their weird medical problems. They think you're like a doctor because you've gotten yourself figured out a little bit. So they come to you and they say, oh, my niece has, she is fainting and she has tummy problems, So you can sort of learn to recognize the symptoms of dysautonomia. They tend to affect the whole body very often. Although you can have a dysautonomia that is just sort of one particular part of the body, but that's less common than the more systemic illness. So orthostatic intolerance is, lightheaded when you're standing up, feeling like you're going to faint or actually fainting, having blood pressure regulation problems, maybe heart rate regulation problems. GI motility is a big issue in autonomic disorders. Your autonomic nervous system controls your movement of food through your GI tract. So when your autonomic nerves are not working properly, you can end up with too fast or too slow GI motility and a lot of symptoms like nausea and pain. Pupil dysfunction, your muscles in your pupil that make it dilate and constrict are controlled by your autonomic nerves as well. So if you have some types of dysautonomia, you'll end up with pupils that are overly dilated or don't constrict in response to light. So you can get light sensitivity and headaches when you're in a bright room. Bladder dysfunction is probably a little less common and usually tends to go with a more severe form of dysautonomia, but it can occur even in milder forms. Abnormal sweating. You can sweat too much or too little. It's sort of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Too hot, too cold, just right. And a lot of things with dysautonomia come in both extremes in different patients. So, and the sweating can also be patchy because it might depend on where your autonomic nerves that control your sweat glands are damaged. Temperature sensitivity goes with the abnormal sweating. A lot of dysautonomia patients they're sensitive to the cold extreme and the heat extreme, but they're also sensitive to sudden changes. Their body their blood flow doesn't react and respond like a normal person might. So even in a normal environment, the sudden change in temperature might kind of just bother them. Flushing, it's often the upper half of the body that they get flushing. That's due to blood flow issues in their skin that's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And in males with more severe forms of dysautonomia, they will get erectile dysfunction. So what is POTS? POTS has a specific diagnostic criteria. So a lot of times you hear people, now that POTS is becoming a little bit more well-known, I'll have people say to me, oh, my niece faints a lot, she must have POTS. I'm like, oh, well, there's a specific criteria that should be followed. So POTS requires an increase in heart rate of 30 beats per minute or more within the first 10 minutes of standing in adult patients, and 40 beats per minute or more in pediatric patients under 18. Younger than 12, we don't have a consensus statement that says this is what the criteria should be, but we know it would be more than 40 because the younger the child, the naturally higher the heart rate is. So in addition to the heart rate increase, you have to have the absence of orthostatic hypotension. This causes a lot of controversy on the patient support groups because patients say, well, my blood pressure does drop and I do have POTS, And so my answer to this is I didn't make up the rules. This is the consensus of the Heart Rhythm Society and the American Academy of American Autonomic Society, and basically dozens of cardiac and neurology professional organizations from around the world have come to this agreement on what POTS is. It's really a man-made definition. It's what we define it as. So orthostatic hypotension is its own beast. It doesn't mean you're not sick. It actually means you're probably more sick if you have orthostatic hypotension. That's a blood pressure drop of 20/10 or more within the first 3 minutes of standing. So a lot of POTS patients will have a milder drop in their blood pressure when they stand up, or maybe that blood pressure drop will occur after 3 minutes. So that would not be called orthostatic hypotension under the current definition. So they could have a POTS diagnosis. But even if you have tachycardia, if you persistently drop your blood pressure that much, the 20/10 drop or more within the first 3 minutes, you could still have tachycardia, but you would probably get diagnosed with orthostatic hypotension if it was happening every time you stood up. And it's important to know the difference because orthostatic hypotension tends to be associated with more severe forms of dysautonomia and more progressive neurological diseases like multiple system atrophy or autonomic failure. But I don't want to scare anyone because a lot of POTS patients, a lot of EDS patients do have a milder drop in blood pressure, but it's usually not to the extent of orthostatic hypotension. So in addition to having wacky vitals, you have to have symptoms. If you just have this change in your heart rate, but you don't feel any symptoms, then you're not sick. You just have a weird heart rate. Some people, believe it or not, have these really dramatic heart rate changes from laying to standing, and they don't feel any symptoms. So, okay, then that's fine. But if you do have symptoms, they're usually orthostatically related, meaning you feel worse when you stand up, you feel better when you lay down, and that's due to blood flow issues in POTS patients. So you would need to have symptoms, and most experts would say that the symptoms should last 6 months or longer before we officially call it POTS. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't treat it in the first 6 months. Probably the earlier you treat it, the better off. Well, first of all, you would be suffering less if you treated it appropriately as soon as possible, but you might actually ward off some of the deconditioning that can happen when someone has this for a long time undiagnosed and untreated. So the symptoms have to be worsened by standing and improved by laying down. That's not to say that every symptom goes away when you lay down. A lot of POTS patients will have GI symptoms when they're laying down, or they have migraines that start when they're upright and continue while they're laying down. And you have a question? Sure.
What about, so I know a lot of PDS patients especially, we don't pass the tilt table test or fail it in the sense that we don't show, but at the same time we're symptomatic when we stand up.
Right.
And often our heart, it's that gradual, you know, the tilt table test is the industry standard.
Right.
If you still have POTS, if you become symptomatic when you stand up, like just.
That's a good question. I'm going to repeat the question so the people listening at home, in case they couldn't hear. The question was, what if you don't have an official POTS diagnosis on the tilt test, but you still have all of these symptoms when you stand up and you don't feel right? And that's fairly common. You know, the POTS is a particular type of dysautonomia. There are other types of autonomic dysfunction that can be milder or even more severe that maybe just don't show up on the tilt the way that POTS does. So generally, when someone has orthostatic symptoms, when they stand up, they feel worse, they feel lightheaded, but they don't meet the POTS criteria. Often the catch-all is orthostatic intolerance. POTS is just a form of orthostatic intolerance. It actually used to be called chronic orthostatic intolerance, but then they kind of separated out POTS as like its own thing, and everyone else who has this would still get called orthostatic intolerance.
So I guess that's a great point. I think for clarifying that for me. But when I stand up at home, my heart rate jumps up.
Right.
But because the tilt table test is so gradual, I guess after my body gets used to it, or is it so like why is that?
So I probably don't have the answer that requires. The tilt testing is standardized. It's been done on healthy people. It's been done on people with all different types of diseases, and they use a very specific angle. One thing that I did find a sort of interesting little nugget last time I had my autonomic testing done is that they don't tilt you all the way upright to 90 degrees, because then your muscles in your legs would kick in and your muscles would help pump the blood back to your heart. So they put it usually to 70 degrees of a tilt, so your leg muscles are not engaging, and that's intentional to really get to see what your autonomic nervous system is doing to constrict your blood vessels rather than your muscle pump. So that's one reason that they use the tilt. I don't have a great answer on why, you know, real life and tilt. Some doctors might say testing real life is better. Others might say testing tilt is better. But either way, also failing the tilt test, you had mentioned that. So that means different things to different doctors. So I wouldn't really use that term. Some doctors would say if you faint, you've failed it or you've passed it. And in POTS, we're not trying to make people faint when we tilt them. Most POTS patients are actually not fainters. They just constantly feel like they're going to faint. There's a smaller subset of POTS patients that actually faint. So let me, and then the last criteria is, the last criteria is absence of other overt causes of orthostatic symptoms or tachycardia. That's kind of the catch-all for like, because you don't have something else. But the tricky thing is most POTS patients do have something else. So what this really means is if you just had major surgery yesterday and you lost 3 pints of blood, of course you're going to have tachycardia and your hemodynamics are going to be all messed up when you stand up. So we wouldn't call that person POTS. And if you have hyperthyroidism and you have, you know, tons of thyroid hormones churning out, giving you tachycardia, we wouldn't call that POTS. Unless if you treated the thyroid disorder and the person still had orthostatic tachycardia, then they might have POTS and a thyroid problem. But that last one is the tricky one that the experts argue over the most, probably. So POTS is not new. It's been around probably as long as people have been walking on 2 feet, but it's been in the medical literature since at least the Civil War. And this was the military physician who wrote about it, Jacob da Costa. They used to call it da Costa syndrome. And through the years, it's had many different names, but when you read these old journal articles, you can clearly tell they're talking about POTS. In the 80s, mitral valve prolapse syndrome was a popular term for it, and there's still one clinic down, I think in Alabama, who still uses that term. So if you're on the support groups and you hear people saying, I have mitral valve prolapse syndrome, they probably have POTS. So we encourage them to see a doctor who uses more modern terminology. So I don't know how many people in this room know about POTS already in detail or not, but these are just some of the symptoms. It's very overwhelming for patients at times because it comes with so many different symptoms. And when you have 5 minutes to explain to a doctor what's going on when you're trying to get diagnosed, you can't even list all your symptoms in your whole appointment because there's so many symptoms. And it really does make you sound like a crazy person when you start rattling off like 100 different symptoms. So these are sort of the most commonly reported symptoms. And all of these have to do with the autonomic nerves not working properly. Exercise intolerance is really a hallmark symptom of POTS, and it's really unfortunate because exercise is one of the best ways to help manage POTS symptoms. It's not a magic cure by any means, but it does really help build your blood volume and improve your autonomic function when you exercise regularly. But telling a really, really sick POTS patient to go ahead and exercise is sort of like telling a person who's underwater to just go ahead and breathe, you know? It's really, really, really hard, and they have to really gradually build into it. Go ahead, question. Sure, well, I have some slides later on about exercise. Can we save that for later? Okay. POTS is pretty common. I remember when I first got diagnosed in 2010 at Cornell, I had a neurologist tell me, this is a rare disease, you're never going to meet anyone else who has it, and you're never going to find a doctor who knows how to treat it. I was like, wow, way to give me some depressing news. But it turns out he was wrong. I was going to meet every doctor who ever heard of POTS, and I've met thousands of people that have it, and it's not rare at all. There's some unusual microphone noise.
With an online class.
So I don't know if anyone at home can hear this, but we're apparently hearing someone's phone conversation.
All right, I'll see you in a little bit.
Okay, we'll keep going. Mayo Clinic estimates that POTS impacts 1 out of 100 teenagers, and we know from other research that half of patients have onset after their teenage years in adulthood. So the current estimates, the original estimates in the literature were 400,000 to 500,000 POTS patients, and the current estimates are 1 to 3 million. Part of that is increased awareness. Some of the experts think that there may be an increase in the actual occurrence of POTS, but we really don't know because we don't have good epidemiological data. And that is one of the research projects that Dysautonomia International has been pushing for, because even though knowing the number doesn't help us treat our disease better, it helps us get more research funding from the government and from the pharmaceutical industry to say, like, hey, there's a lot of people that have this. We need to do something about it. And I think the kind of mindset about EDS hypermobility type is sort of heading in that same direction. Like, it's not really as rare as we thought it was. So we need to have better numbers on how many people have it so we can really advocate for more research funding. And I think also the rareness issue is relevant to educating physicians too. If you try to educate a room full of medical students or physicians and you say this thing is really rare, in their minds they're going to say, well, I really don't need to know about it because I'm probably never going to see this. But if you say, no, this is really, fairly common, 1 out of 100 kids is, at least every high school in America probably has a kid with POTS, and probably the same with EDS, hypermobility type anyways. So it's really good for you guys to get out there and try to get more accurate numbers on how many people have this, and then use that to your advantage when you're doing your awareness and advocacy work. This is a study I did in 2014 with one of our other board members who is getting her PhD in autonomic neuroscience right now. And we wanted to know the age of onset of symptoms, not when you were diagnosed, because we know that these patients can take years to get diagnosed, but we wanted to know how old were you when you started having symptoms. And the peak age of onset for POTS is 13 or 14 years old. But you can see some people said they were born with it, and some people got it as old as 56 years old. And we've actually met patients who've developed it even older than that. So half of patients get it before age 18 and half get it over age 18. It is definitely not a teenage syndrome, despite what CNN tells us. Okay, so these are different terms that have been used to describe characteristics of POTS, and some patients and even some doctors will just say, oh, so-and-so has neuropathic POTS and this patient has hyperadrenergic POTS. So what I think is really important for patient and medical professionals to understand is that these are not distinct types of POTS. They're overlapping, and most people have a little bit of each of these characteristics. Neuropathic, meaning they have some small fiber nerve damage that is probably contributing to their POTS symptoms. Hypovolemic means they have low blood volume. Almost all POTS patients have some amount of low blood volume. Half of the POTS patients have some neuropathy that can be documented. And hyperadrenergic means too much norepinephrine floating around in their bloodstream. And norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that is sort of makes you jumpy. It's your fight or flight response chemical in your body. And almost all POTS patients have some amount of elevated norepinephrine. And then some POTS patients have really, really elevated norepinephrine. I have a question up here. Go ahead.
Yeah, Lauren, I know we briefly spoke on Facebook, one of the threads. I had mentioned the hyperadrenergic, if I'm pronouncing it right. What's your response to, now I know you're not saying it's that subtype and it's not a distinct entity, but what is your response to, you can call him one of the pioneers, from the things I've seen with his patients, I guess, I don't know if it's as modern or up to date, but he specifically would diagnose a patient with the hyperadrenergic type. What is your response to that? I know we briefly spoke on that topic.
Yeah. So Dr. Grubb is on our board, and we work with him all the time. I actually have his book right here. We have copies for sale later if anyone's interested. So every doctor has their own way of doing this, and that's sort of one of the most frustrating things for patients. You have like 5 of the world's best experts who all disagree or use different terms to mean the same thing. So it's not necessarily wrong to tell someone they're hyperadrenergic. Some patients with POTS really do have really, really excessive norepinephrine levels that are the major component of their illness, more so maybe than the low blood volume. But it does not necessarily mean that they don't have hypovolemia or they don't have neuropathy. That's sort of the takeaway that is. Right. And none of the experts agree on what hyperadrenergic is. Because if everyone has a little bit of elevated norepinephrine, then what's the cutoff for what's bad enough to be called hyperadrenergic? And what if some patients have it change over time? When I was first diagnosed, we knew I had small fiber neuropathy, we knew I had low blood volume, and hyperadrenergic was never discussed. EDS was, the first doctor said to me, "Are you flexible?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, you have EDS." And I was like, "What? Don't you have to do an examination for that?" So then later on, doctors told me I didn't have EDS. And then more recently, they told me I did. And I'm just like, this is so frustrating. Like, I'm leading this patient organization and doing research, and I still can't get an answer. So most recently, I was at the AUTONOMIC lab in Virginia, and I was diagnosed with hyperadrenergic POTS. So it's like, what does this mean? We need, in order to really have meaning in that word, it needs to have an agreed upon definition, and it doesn't right now. So these are POTS legs. The person standing on the bath mat has the more typical legs of, sort of blotchy, sort of purple. The feet in the middle is a woman who told me her one foot is always that color and the right foot is the normal color. So that's not necessarily due to POTS, but POTS can occur with other sort of vascular abnormality, sort of weird things going on with your blood flow. And then this person standing in the shower, her pale white leg was up on the wall shaving. And if you have dysautonomia or EDS, you know how impressive that was, that someone had her leg up on the wall shaving. So her leg that was up on the wall is the normal color, and the leg that was down below her heart was became ACROCYANOSIS, which just means sort of a blood flow problem. It isn't actually blood pooling that causes that funny discoloration. It's sort of a stagnation of the blood flow. Dr. Stewart at New York Medical College did some kind of cool research on that. A lot of POTS patients will have coat hanger pain, and this is common in other types of autonomic disorders that involve an orthostatic problem as well. It's because you're not getting enough blood flow to the big muscles in your neck and your traps, like your upper back. You get a lactic acid buildup, and it's very painful. And you know, most pain meds don't really help it because it's due to a blood flow problem. So my best advice on if you have this is you need to increase your blood volume with more hydration, more salt, maybe more Florinef. And massage actually helps kind of get rid of the lactic acid buildup. So I try to do a little self-massage like every day. Gynecological abnormalities are very common in female POTS patients. And a lot of these things are things that are associated with sort of increased estrogen or sort of abnormal hormone levels. Endometriosis is much higher in POTS than in controls. Galactorrhea is a term that most people don't know. It actually means lactating when you're not pregnant. And it's a pretty harmless condition, but if your 14-year-old daughter who has POTS suddenly starts lactating, let me tell you, that is pretty frightening. A couple moms emailing us freaking out, like, oh my God, my kid's pregnant. I'm like, no, she's not. So it's not funny though. I mean, it's pretty devastating to a young person to have that, and abnormal menstrual cycle as well. So POTS can be very disabling. The disability seen in POTS, this is an older study from Mayo from 2002. The disability seen in POTS was equivalent to the disability seen in heart failure and COPD. And those are usually older patients. You know, maybe they have a history of smoking or some kind of contributing factors. And POTS is happening in largely young, otherwise healthy people. Importantly, the psychological domains in POTS are similar to healthy controls, congestive heart failure, and COPD patients. I think there's a tendency for doctors to assume a young person coming in with a list of 40 symptoms probably has some kind of psych problem. But it looks from the research like that's really not the driving factor in POTS. Quality of life, the higher the bar, the better the quality of life. So this compared patients with POTS to patients with back pain and end-stage renal disease. These are people who were on dialysis, you know, probably a couple times a week, really, really horrible quality of life. And their quality of life mentally and physically was similar to what's seen in POTS. This is a study from Vanderbilt. So I partnered with Dr. Satish Raj, who was originally at Vanderbilt's Autonomic Lab doing a ton of POTS research, and then he moved up to actually his home base, University of Calgary, to run a new autonomic lab there, which is great for the Canadian patients and not so great for folks who are going to Vanderbilt. But there are other really, really great doctors at Vanderbilt still. So we partnered together with some other Dysautonomia International sort of advisory board members and some other folks at Vanderbilt to develop a really, really detailed POTS patient survey that we distributed online. Did anyone in here participate in the big POTS survey? One. Wow. Okay. We got to get more EDS people in it next time, guys. Come on. Well, it's still enrolling. We did the first sort of data dump from the first group of 3,300 patients, but we're keeping it open and using it sort of like a registry to launch future studies from. So I will share the link with you for that. So we had 3,300 patients, and they answered about almost 400 questions each. And one of the questions was, how long did it take to get diagnosed? And we did a study in 2013 that came up with 5 years and 11 months as the average diagnostic delay. It ranged from, you know, got diagnosed at the first visit to, you know, 30, 40, 50 years, just like the EDS video that you showed in the beginning. So the average in 2013 was 5 years and 11 months. And so when we repeated the same question in 2015, the average was 4 years and 2 months. So that's a pretty good improvement, even though it's still way too long. We are seeing some improvement, and we are noticing, if you end up in the emergency room with POTS on Long Island now, chances are the doctor is going to have the basic fundamentals of POTS down. They're not really going to be an expert, but they're going to say, oh, I know someone who has POTS. So we really think that physician education courses we've been doing around the country, and Dysautonomia Awareness Month, which we launched 5 years ago. This October 1st will be our 5th one. It's every October. You know, these things sort of do add up and make a difference slowly over time. And also just more people getting diagnosed than their doctors have to learn about it because they've been diagnosed. So we're sort of maybe reaching a critical mass of people being diagnosed with POTS so that everyone eventually will know about it, but still going to take some time. This is also from the big POTS study. We asked POTS patients, what else have you been diagnosed with? And it's a long list. 84% of POTS patients have been diagnosed with at least one other disorder. Migraine, probably the most common, and that's not surprising because migraine itself could be considered a form of dysautonomia. There's a sympathetic dysfunction in people who have migraines in the blood vessels in their head. So vitamin D deficiency is pretty common. You see that EDS was 28%. So in this, I didn't break down the types of EDS, but we did ask that in the survey. And when we publish our journal article on this, we will elaborate. But it was mostly hypermobility type, which is not surprising. 16% of POTS patients report a confirmed autoimmune diagnosis, most often Hashimoto's, which is the most common autoimmune diagnosis to begin with. Also celiac, Sjogren's, and lupus. And that's relevant because diabetes is the #1 cause of autonomic neuropathy. Sjogren's is the #2 cause, and celiac is the #3 cause of identifiable causes of autonomic neuropathy. So it's not surprising that those two would end up on the list. And lupus is associated with some autonomic neuropathies, usually in association with Sjogren's or maybe antiphospholipid antibodies as well. We know some of the comorbidities listed here are underdiagnosed in this cohort. And so why is that? Well, most of the existing research on POTS comes from the big research centers where they really know what they're doing, and they give people this fancy workup that looks for everything. If you are the average patient and you're just seeing your local hometown cardiologist who maybe has one other POTS patient or doesn't really know the details, they're not going to know to look for small fiber neuropathy or hypovolemia or maybe even EDS, right? So these things might be underdiagnosed in the general population who's not seeing the experts. So our cohort of 3,300 patients, 10% of them had seen one of the top specialty centers. And so the other 90% are just, you know, they might be seeing a good doctor, but they're not necessarily getting the big full workup, you know. So vasovagal syncope was underreported. We know from other research that 20 to 30% of POTS patients have vasovagal syncope. And in this study, I can't see it on here, it was something about, maybe about 13% of patients reported being diagnosed with it. So that's about half that are missing out, maybe because their doctors aren't doing a tilt table test, or maybe because the doctor just assumes the fainting is POTS and doesn't think that vasovagal syncope is separate. But this is just sort of a good example of why, if you can, you should try to go to one of the specialty centers at least once. And they usually don't do a lot of follow-up care, but we had 2 questions. Let me take the first one from up here.
What is the difference between, I've had a self-treatment test. I've passed out every time you raise it.
Mm-hmm.
I've passed out like numerous times, just like in a store.
Oh.
Times. But now I get to the point where I feel like I'm going to pass out, but I don't pass out.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the...
And I have all of the other symptoms of POTS, like
right.
From the bladder problem to everything, like the gastro, everything.
So the question for people at home was, what's the difference between vasovagal syncope and POTS if someone has a lot of fainting and also a lot of the other symptoms of POTS? And the, right. So where was it done? Okay, I had mine done at South Nassau too.
They put me on medication.
The good folks at South Nassau are not POTS experts. So I would say, I mean, if you're doing well, then you don't need to go on a wild goose chase looking for the perfect diagnosis, right? But if you're not doing well, it would make sense to try to see someone who really has expertise in distinguishing the diagnoses. But it doesn't necessarily really change your treatment, whether it's vasovagal syncope or POTS. The only difference is people with vasovagal syncope, right before they faint, they usually have a moment of bradycardia, which is low heart rate, or even a pause in their heart rate that causes an interruption of blood flow to the brain, and that's why they faint. And that's actually like a protective mechanism. If you're not getting blood flow to your brain says, hey, we're going to lay down, we'll get more blood if we do that, you know, sort of oversimplifying a really complicated process. But I would say that I initially was also tilted there and at St. Francis, which is supposed to be a big heart hospital, and they both said, oh, you just have vasovagal syncope. And then when I went to Cleveland Clinic, they were like, no. So, but yeah, it's frustrating for patients because you go to the doctor and these doctors it's not that they're bad doctors, they just haven't been educated on this stuff. It's not taught in medical schools largely. So Lisa had a question. Jennifer, sorry.
What is the testing for hypovolemia?
Work phone just rang a couple minutes ago, but I didn't answer right after you called.
So I really wouldn't recommend to get it done because if you have POTS, you can assume you have hypovolemia. It's been concluded in the research. Pretty much we all have it. And the treatment is salt, fluids, and Florinef. There's really no special, there's a little bit of other things you can do. But it's usually done, the way they really measure it is with a Daxor blood volume analysis. It's a blood volume test with a radio tracer. So they inject something a little bit radioactive into you and they watch how it cycles through your body and they keep taking blood to see how quickly it dissipates. It's a bit of a process. It's really only done for research purposes. I know Columbia has the machine to do it, but I called there many moons ago trying to get the test done and they're like, we only do this for research. Why do you want this done? Just drink more fluids. So yeah, I mean, everyone wants to know because they're curious, like what's going on with my body. But if you have POTS, you probably have some hypovolemia. So, okay, let me keep going here. This is not from the big POTS study, but it's from a prior study that we did looking at psych misdiagnosis in POTS patients. 83% of POTS patients were given some kind of psych label, sometimes an actual diagnosis, sometimes something like all in your head, which is not even a diagnosis. We asked them, you know, what did your doctor tell you before you had POTS? And when we say check all of the above, I see somebody's laughing. You probably could check every one of these, right? I could check. I was told I had somatoform disorder. I was told I had conversion disorder. I was told it was just anxiety. First, I had a doctor telling me I was hungover. I was like, really? You know? So, and it's so frustrating for patients to be told it's all in their head. And I know EDS patients who don't have POTS go through the same thing. So you might think, well, if 83% of people were diagnosed with a psych problem, maybe there is a lot of psych problems in POTS. But the research suggests otherwise. So in 1992, Mayo did this study I mentioned earlier, showing that psychological domains were similar between healthy controls, congestive heart failure, COPD, and POTS. Vanderbilt did a study in 2009 showing that POTS patients were actually slightly less anxious than the general population and had a little bit more mild depression, which is not surprising if anyone dealing with a chronic debilitating illness is going to have some kind of emotional consequences to that. And in Mayo, 2016, Mayo did a pediatric POTS study on about 172 patients. And these patients had their mental composite score was completely normal. And it didn't matter, the patients who had recovered had the same sort of mental health profile as the patients who didn't recover. So, you know, everyone always says, have a positive attitude, and it is helpful. You'll have a better quality of life if you can find a way to keep the attitude positive, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're more likely or less likely to get better from POTS. I want to say for the patients in the room, if you do think you have a psychological problem or even maybe something that's not to the level of a real problem, but you know, you're having some emotional issues, don't be afraid to address it. I know personally, after being told for 2 years that you're crazy, you don't want to say, okay, I think I am having depression or I am having some anxiety, because you're really worried that a doctor is going to just stop treating your POTS and think you're just nuts. So don't be afraid to talk to your doctor or a counselor or a priest or whatever, because if you do have that kind of problem, it's going to make your autonomic symptoms worse, because stress and anxiety kind of makes the autonomic stuff even more severe than it currently would be from your POTS. Okay, so this is sort of my controversial part of the talk here. Hopefully nobody will throw tomatoes at me. So is EDS POTS different than non-EDS POTS? The short answer is we have no idea, but I want to have this conversation with you guys to sort of get people to think about this in a different way. The assumption, if you ask the average EDS patient that has POTS, why do you have POTS? They'll say, oh, because I have EDS, I have stretchy veins, and I get blood pooling, and that's why I have POTS. And that's a really good common sense explanation. It's a good thing to tell your friends and family when they're trying to ask you what's wrong with you, because it's a simple explanation. But we have no research confirming that that's actually what's happening in EDS patients who have POTS. And it actually conflicts with some other things we know about POTS. So, leading this patient organization, my feeling is patients deserve more than an assumption. We need answers. And that takes research, which is expensive, and which is why we are raising money for research. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that EDS and POTS aren't related, because clearly they are, but we don't understand what that mechanism is yet. So here are some of the things that explain, or that point out, why the sort of stretchy veins theory doesn't really give enough of an answer to explain what's going on in EDS POTS patients. So autoimmunity is a big thing in POTS now. Even before the autoimmune POTS research was happening, which it's going on now, there were a lot of things that suggested that autoimmunity was a possibility as a thing that's going on in POTS patients. The female predominance, because most autoimmune diseases are female predominant. 50% of POTS patients have a post-viral or post-infectious onset, which also suggests an immune-mediated process. 50% of POTS patients have small fiber neuropathy, which happens in a lot of autoimmune diseases. The increased rate of estrogen problems I mentioned earlier is also associated with an increased connection to autoimmunity. Generally, testosterone is autoimmune protective, and estrogen maybe promotes it a little bit more. And mast cell abnormalities are known to occur early in the phase of many different autoimmune diseases, and we know that POTS patients, including EDS POTS patients, some of them have these kind of funky mast cell issues going on. So EDS and autoimmunity by itself, separate from POTS. Dr. Francomano and colleagues at the NIH back in 2006 reported a higher rate of autoimmunity than expected in their own EDS patients. They found 12 of 72 consecutive EDS patients had either rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, or Sjogren's. And these are all really serious autoimmune diseases that need to be diagnosed as soon as possible to be treated, because they're treated very differently than EDS or dysautonomia. 7 of 72 of these patients had Raynaud's, which is also, it's not autoimmune itself, but it's seen in a lot of autoimmune disorders. So their conclusion was, this raises the possibility that abnormalities of the extracellular matrix might contribute to the development of autoimmunity, importantly in the presence of other genetic or environmental influences. So this never became a full journal article, but it's an abstract and it's online, and you can find it if you want to take a look. Just Google EDS Francomano autoimmunity and it pops up. So then we look at EDS, POTS, and autoimmunity all together. And we don't have much on this, but the Big POTS survey did kind of dig into it a little bit. 16% of all POTS patients reported autoimmunity, a confirmed autoimmune diagnosis, but 18% of the EDS POTS patients did. So that's kind of interesting. You would think that if EDS was a totally separate thing from autoimmune POTS, that there wouldn't be as much autoimmunity, but there's actually a little bit more autoimmunity being reported in the EDS patients. So this is a bunch of little factoids about the current research that's going on in POTS in general, right? So these studies, the preliminary studies, most of them did not specifically look to see, like, do these patients have EDS or not, and then do they have antibodies? But as an organization, Dysautonomia International has said, if we're funding research, we're making all of the researchers screen for EDS, whatever kind of POTS research they're doing, because we think that, you know, if we publish results on our Facebook page about, you know, 72% of POTS patients improve with exercise. The very first question we get is, does that apply to the EDS patients too? So we know that that's important to patients to understand. So we're requiring it in our research. Go ahead, question.
Experience in the online community, there are a host of different cluster of us that have the EDS, mast cell, and POTS, and now also we're learning CBID on top of it.
Okay, so there's some stuff about mast cell stuff. I didn't include things on immune dysfunction because we really don't have good data on it, but autoimmunity and immune deficiency, there's actually a relationship that is in a prior literature, not related to dysautonomia or EDS. So there is, you know, general immune dysfunction is a problem. Yeah, agreed. It's just, I just don't have slides on that. Go ahead.
Relationship with hypersensitivity reactions like type 3, type 2, and elevated IgA.
Let me, so I don't have anything on IgA in here, but I have some mast cell stuff we'll get to later. Let me keep going through this. So in general, in 1993, the first article describing POTS in its current definition was by Mayo Clinic. And they said in the very first article, we think this is an immune-mediated autonomic neuropathy that's sort of distal peripheral autonomic nerves. And then sort of not much happened for a long time. They were just trying to figure out how to manage these patients. And, you know, they were trying out different drugs and exercises and fluids and stuff like that. In 2012, a young researcher at Mayo did a paper that was a little bit confusing what he was trying to do, but he found that POTS patients had antibodies to 40 different cardiac membrane proteins. And these are receptors and different proteins on the surface of the cells in your blood vessels and in your heart. And so he published that, and it didn't really make a big splash. I got excited about it when I found it, and I used to have the POTS Girl blog, and so I posted a big article about it, but it didn't seem like the researchers, the rest of the research community took an interest. And then in 2014, the University of Oklahoma, Dr. David Kem, he was studying cardiovascular antibodies in Graves' disease, which is autoimmune, in Graves' patients who had atrial fibrillation. And he noticed that a bunch of his antibody-positive Graves' patients had this POTS diagnosis on their chart. He wasn't a POTS guy, but he looked into it and he thought, oh, these antibodies make a lot of sense for this diagnosis. So he contacted some of his cardiology colleagues and said, can you send me some serum from your POTS patients at his university? And he did, and they had these antibodies. And then he contacted Vanderbilt, and they're probably one of the Mayo and Vanderbilt are sort of the two big POTS research centers. So he contacted Vanderbilt and said, can you send me some serum from some of your POTS patients? I just want to see if they have these antibodies. And sure enough, Vanderbilt sent blood from healthy people and from POTS people, and they didn't label it. They just kind of sent it in a box with, you know, numbers on the vials. And the Oklahoma lab was able to diagnose who had POTS based on just the blood sample, because they could identify these antibodies in people who had POTS and not in healthy people. So Vanderbilt was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So they partnered on this study. The first study was small, 14 patients, but 100% of POTS patients had these adrenergic receptor antibodies. These are adrenergic receptors are a part of the sympathetic nervous system, and they use norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. So 100%, it's a small study. So we need a bigger study to see, does that carry out when we study 200 patients? Is it also 100%? So we invited them to the Dysautonomia International Conference in 2014, and they collected serum from about, I want to say, 130 patients at our conference, and they collected some additional back at their lab. Hasn't published yet because research takes forever, but it's in progress. 2014, Dr. Abdullah at the Children's Heart Institute in Virginia reported increase in double negative T cells in pediatric POTS. And it's 15%, so it's not that much, But this is important because a lot of people think, well, pediatric POTS is different. It's the adults that have the autoimmunity and the kids are different. And that may be true, but he did find evidence of autoimmunity in the pediatric POTS population as well. 2015, SUNY Buffalo is Dr. Blichstein, and Dysautonomia International gave her a grant to do a chart review of her existing patients, and she looked at the past 100 patients. 20% of them had a confirmed autoimmune disease, and a third of them had some kind of antibody, whether or not it was enough to make a specific autoimmune diagnosis. And that's quite a bit of people. Mayo Clinic has a really world-famous autoimmune neurology lab that looks at neural antibodies. They're kind of the place in the world for this. And they had serum on file from 33 POTS patients who had had complete autonomic testing. And they said, you know, let's look at this serum for our autoimmune dysautonomia antibody panel. And normally this isn't something that anyone had associated with POTS before. And when they did, sure enough, 45% of the patients had either thyroid-related antibodies or these autonomic neural antibodies. And those antibodies were found in 4.4% of healthy people. So there's a clear difference between what's going on in POTS and what's going on in healthy individuals. Vanderbilt found increased interleukin-6, which is associated with a lot of different inflammatory and autoimmune conditions. Stiles and Gudesblatt, that's me, and I don't know if any of you see Mark Gudesblatt locally, but he's a neurologist in Patchogue who's very interested in autonomic disorders. And he noticed that a lot of the POTS patients had sort of a Sjogren's syndrome-like presentation, myself included. I've actually been diagnosed with Sjogren's, but so he started testing them for these novel Sjogren's antibodies in addition to the typical Sjogren's antibodies. And there are a lot of people who have this Sjogren's-like presentation of autonomic and sensory neuropathy and joint pain and fatigue and a little bit of dry eyes or dry mouth, but they don't test positive for official Sjogren's. So when you looked at the novel Sjogren's antibodies, which are seen early in the course of the disease, and they're not part of the formal diagnostic criteria right now, 41% of the dysautonomia patients who had either dry eyes or dry mouth had some of these antibodies. So that's kind of exciting to be able to follow those patients over time to see if they develop actual Sjogren's. And we have another project in the works. We're trying to look at whether these early Sjogren's patients might actually respond to immunotherapy the way that a more advanced Sjogren's disease patient would. Of that cohort, 10 of them were official POTS patients and 6 of them had the antibodies. So this past year, Dr. Vernino at UT Southwestern looked at muscarinic receptor antibodies. These are receptors that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So Oklahoma is looking at the sympathetic antibodies, and UT Southwestern is looking at the parasympathetic antibodies. And Vernino found that about 90% of POTS patients had antibodies to their parasympathetic nervous system receptors. And really interestingly, the M3 antibody, muscarinic 3, is an early Sjogren's antibody. So it's pretty amazing that that's happening in a subset of POTS patients, not everyone. He wanted to do that on a larger cohort, so we invited him to our conference to collect last month. We collected from 156 POTS patients, and I think he's collecting controls back at his lab. Not too many healthy people coming to the Dysautonomia International Conference. Okay, so then most recently, this actually hasn't published yet. Dr. Kemp presented it at our conference, so I figured I'm allowed to talk about it if he already talked about it in public. It should be coming out in EuroPace, which is a European cardiology journal, any day now, any week. It's already been accepted for publication, and they did all their editing. So this was a second cohort of POTS patients from Sweden, 17 POTS, 7 with vasovagal syncope, and 11 healthy people. And they found the adrenergic antibodies in 100% of the POTS patients again, and none in the vasovagal syncope or healthy patients, which is really interesting to see that. And this is a totally separate group of patients from the one they first tested. These are just the citations for all that autoimmune stuff. Sure. It's a lot, I know. Yes.
So are these blood tests that like our doctors?
So, okay, let me go back really quickly and talk to you about that. So let's see. The adrenergic antibodies is the adrenergic and the muscarinic antibodies are the sort of the two main things we're tracking down right now. And those are not commercially available. Those are only available through a research protocol at these like 2 or 3 places that are testing it. There is a lab in Europe that is testing them. We have no idea if it's accurate. The experts tell us it's not accurate. Don't waste your money and get yourself confused about what you actually have going on. But I'm not one to tell patients, you know, not to if they want to do it. But I think what we're aiming for as an organization is having enough data on these antibodies in POTS patients, in healthy people, in people with EDS POTS and non-EDS POTS, you know, really sort of understanding what these antibodies are so that a commercial test can be developed. And like my dream come true would be a diagnostic test for POTS. It's a blood test, right? Right, and also how many doctors would, who might, you know, think it's not a real problem, oh, there's a blood test for it, now it's a real disease, you know? But if it is autoimmune, and I say if because we're not all the way there yet on the research, if it is autoimmune, there will be blood tests, and more importantly, there should be new mechanisms, new ways to treat it, because we don't treat autoimmune diseases with just salt and fluids. We do things to impact the immune system. And Dr. Kem has actually already started doing that. He has a small study, about maybe like 10 to 12 patients, where he's giving them IVIG to see how they do over time. And University of Calgary has funding to do plasmapheresis and IVIG in POTS patients, and they're currently recruiting. But you have to be Canadian, I'm pretty sure. So, sorry guys. So there are doctors who do it. You can't get IVIG approved for POTS or for EDS, but if you have some other condition that might be approvable, the problem is that it's so expensive, and you really, unless you're like a billionaire, you can't afford to pay cash for it. It's $20,000 a month. And also IVIG, having been on it myself for the past few years for my Sjogren's, it is a really not pleasant drug to take. It is not like, oh, I'm just going to go take a little saline. No, you can get aseptic meningitis, you can get blood clots, you can get hemolysis, like horrible side effects in some patients. So you would really want to know that it's going to work before you go and do it. So I know that there's a tendency when we're desperate, when we're so sick, we'll try just about anything. But I hope that people wait for the research so we can know who is it going to help, who is it not going to help. How can we give it to them in the safest way possible so that they don't get the side effects? The autoimmune dysautonomia panel that Mayo studied is commercially available through Mayo Clinic Labs. It's a send-out test to Mayo. It's not like you could go to LabCorp, but Mayo does it. The novel Sjogren's antibodies you can get if you just Google Bausch & Lomb SJO, S-J-O. That's a panel that Bausch & Lomb is selling. Any doctor can order that. And what else? Interleukin-6, I think most doctors can order that, but it's not really helpful because it's not going to diagnose you with anything. Thyroid antibodies are widely available. Let's see. I think that covers, oh, the double negative T cells. Most doctors could do that, but they wouldn't really know what to do with it unless you had a really severe problem. And that's probably not the main thing that we're looking at here in POTS. Okay, so how am I doing on time? I feel like I've been going longer than I expected. What? Oh my gosh, really? Okay, so I'll try to go a little faster. Small fiber neuropathy happens in there's different types of small fiber nerves. The most relevant ones to this talk are sensory, which usually would cause pain if you had problems with your small fiber sensory nerves. Pseudomotor, which control your sweat glands in your skin, and vasomotor, which control your blood vessel constriction and dilation. Probably the most important one for the question of, you know, stretchy veins in EDS or in dysautonomia overall. 50% of POTS patients have pseudomotor dysfunction. So it doesn't mean that they don't have the vasomotor neuropathy. The problem is we don't have an easy way to test vasomotor neuropathy right now. So our organization funded part of a study at Harvard looking at trying to develop a technique to easily quantify vasomotor neuropathy. And we're hoping that will publish maybe this year or next year. We're kind of excited about it because we think that the pseudomotor neuropathy that happens in POTS is just like a marker of something gone wrong. nobody's fainting and having GI motility problems because their sweat glands aren't working properly, right? That's just sort of a marker that there's an autonomic problem. The vasomotor neuropathy finding would really confirm, you know, why are these blood flow abnormalities happening? So more than POTS, we have more pseudomotor neuropathy in EDS patients confirmed by the research group in Ghent. I think it's in Belgium, right? So this is more common in EDS than it is in just plain old POTS. Let's see, I talked about the Harvard stuff. So when these nerves, when the vasomotor nerves are damaged, your blood vessels can't constrict the way that they're supposed to. So this raises some really important questions. Does the vasomotor small fiber neuropathy that we presume exists in POTS, does it actually cause the blood pooling in POTS or in EDS POTS? Are there antibodies that we're finding in this other research that caused or contribute to the neuropathy? And we think so, because usually where there's antibodies attacking nerves, eventually they do something to the nerves. But we don't have the solid, link in the research yet. And then could EDS-associated collagen deficits actually contribute to the small fiber neuropathy? This is something that I think desperately needs research in the EDS world. Why do you guys have so much neuropathy? Because it's not just autonomic related neuropathy. A lot of EDS patients have other types of neurological problems. This is a slide from the small fiber neuropathy lab up at Harvard, Dr. Roy Freeman, who happens to be an autonomic neurologist too. And the red, well, the yellow greenish line in the middle is the inside of the blood vessel. This is a small blood vessel. The red is the sympathetic cholinergic fibers. So these are autonomic nerve fibers. And the blue is type 4 collagen, the basement membrane of this kind of conduit of nerves and blood vessel. So I don't really know enough about EDS to know if type 4 collagen is implicated in EDS hypermobility type. And maybe there isn't even research to document that yet. But I do think that there could be a relationship between the collagen in the blood vessels, the nerves, and also that what's not shown in this, in the same exact area where all of this is going on, there's mast cells all over the place, in healthy people too. So if you have problems with your collagen, you have problems with your nerves, you have problems with your mast cells, it's really not surprising that you have problems with your blood vessels. But we really just don't have all the research to figure out what's going on. Hypovolemia, as I mentioned before, almost everyone with POTS has some hypovolemia. It's not really clear how stretchy blood vessels would cause or contribute to hypovolemia. And it's something that would need to be figured out if we were going to accept that the stretchiness of our blood vessels is what's causing the dysautonomia. Vanderbilt had suggested that a partial loss of sympathetic nerve fibers in the kidney may actually be causing the low aldosterone, which then causes the low blood volume, the low plasma volume. Aldosterone is made in your adrenal gland, but in general, most POTS patients have a normal adrenal gland, but it doesn't get the message from the autonomic nervous system to make the aldosterone. So they initially thought sympathetic nerves could be damaged, but now we wonder if there are sympathetic nerve antibodies, maybe those are blocking the kidney from getting the message without actually causing a neuropathy. But again, my answer for everything, we need more research. Iron storage deficiency is also really common in POTS and could contribute to low red blood cell mass. Hyperadrenergic state we talked about before. So if all patients have a little bit of this, it doesn't really explain. So if everyone has some of this going on, it's not really clear how stretchy veins could cause that. There are some ways that it could, but we know that elevated plasma norepinephrine can happen with autonomic neuropathy. It can happen from hypovolemia. It can happen with anxiety disorders. Norepinephrine transporter is sort of a receptor. Sorry, I'm getting out of breath here. Stealing the water, taking a break. The pitfalls of having Sjogren's is you try to lecture with dry mouth and you end up choking. norepinephrine transporter helps your nerves reabsorb the norepinephrine that they've used when they're trying to send messages to each other. And normal people, they lose a little bit of norepinephrine in between each nerve cell. And people with POTS tend to lose more than the normal amount. And we're not really sure why. In some people, there's research suggesting that they have a problem with their norepinephrine transporter, either a genetic mutation itself in the gene that makes the transporter, an epigenetic problem, which is sort of the protein that's sort of around the genetic material. It's kind of confusing, but there's a couple different ways that the genetics are involved. And then finally, do the antibodies we're finding cause an increase in norepinephrine? And there's sort of a theory that they do, but again, we need the research to back it up. Hypertension is probably not really common in EDS POTS, but we do know of EDS POTS patients who have an increase in their blood pressure on tilt, which doesn't really make sense in the context of if they just had stretchy veins, why would they have that? And also, we do know some EDS patients who have not just tilt-related increase in blood pressure, but actual hypertension problems when they're sitting down, when they're laying down. So these are all sort of autonomic problems, and they don't usually go along with stretchy veins. So that's just yet another reason why the stretchy veins concept doesn't really fully explain what's going on. Mast cell dysfunction. He said we were going to get to this eventually. So we don't have a clear answer on the percentage of overlap between mast cell disorders, POTS and EDS, but there is without a doubt an overlap that many people have noticed in themselves, and you see it on the online support groups, and the researchers are sort of finally catching on. I don't mean to say anything bad about the researchers because I'm glad they're doing research on this stuff at all, but do you ever notice that the patients kind of figure things out first and then the researchers kind of finally catch up and do a study on it? But in a sense, that makes sense because we're living with it 24/7 and they're studying us when we come to visit their lab. And I do think one of the, probably the best things about Dysautonomia International is we've built this network of researchers that talk to us and trust us and they listen to us. And when we say, you know, this is a problem and we would love for you guys to do a study on this, they will do it. They really want to do what's right by these patients. So Vanderbilt first reported mast cell in POTS in 2005, and they kind of thought it was a little pretty uncommon at that time. In 2014, Brent Goodman at Mayo, Arizona, reported in an American Academy of Neurology abstract. The reason I don't have the specific percentage is because I couldn't find my photos of the abstract, but it never was online. I had photos of it from the meeting. It was a substantial percentage of patients, but I don't want to say the exact percentage because I can't find the photo. But the NIH has a study going on that's still ongoing. In 2014, they reported on 40 families with hereditary tryptase mutations. Tryptase is a protein that sort of indicates that you have had a problem with your mast cells. Either you've just had a really bad allergic reaction or you're kind of in this chronic mast cell allergic-y kind of state. So they're finding that. And in the people who have this hereditary tryptase mutation, they find that POTS and EDS and also psychiatric problems are kind of common overlaps in these families. And they're still working on that, doing more and more patients. And they're trying to make this test for whatever they're testing for commercially available. So we hooked them up with a gene testing company to see if we can make that happen faster, because we know everyone wants to get tested for it. University of Toronto, sort of not a big place known for POTS research or mast cell stuff, they did a paper in 2015 suggesting that it's a pretty frequent overlap, but they didn't give a specific percentage. There's more studies in progress. Dysautonomia International has a study with Vanderbilt and some researchers, immunologists out in California who are really into mast cell stuff. And I'm sure there's other work that I don't know about in progress. So people who recover, improve. I know one of the sort of saddest things is when you hear of people who are newly diagnosed and they're really scared, because this is really overwhelming when you first get diagnosed with it. And someone will say to them, oh, well, you have EDS associated with your POTS. You're never going to grow out of it. You're never going to get better. And that's so horrible to be that patient learning that information. And it might be true for some patients that this is sort of their permanent, new way of life that they have to get used to. But we do know of EDS POTS patients who actually got better. And I know of one who considers herself fully recovered from POTS. She still has EDS. She still has, I can't forget what, she had some other stuff. But anyways, she's someone who was super sick, was getting IV saline just to try to get through college, and now is running 10Ks and getting a PhD. So people do get better. It's not everyone, I don't want to candy coat things, but I do think it's important as the EDS patient community, when you're talking to newly diagnosed people, give them a little hope. Don't candy coat, but they don't have to think, oh God, I'm never going to get better because I have EDS. Maybe their EDS might never get better. That's kind of, hard to say because it doesn't seem to go away like the way POTS can go away. But this is an example of one of Dr. Kem's patients from Oklahoma. She was a very hypermobile teenager, athletic, active, acute onset POTS after a cold, which is pretty common. She was homebound and almost bedridden. She was diagnosed with EDS and POTS. She had the adrenergic antibodies that Oklahoma was testing for. She received IVIG as part of a research study, and her antibody levels went down. Her POTS symptoms improved, but not 100%. And she still has EDS, but she did see a pretty good improvement on the IVIG. So there may be, this is sort of more support for the idea that maybe the EDS sort of makes us more prone to getting this autoimmune problem, but isn't the root cause of the POTS itself. But we're not sure. So this, I feel like I'm going over on time. Should I just wrap it up, or do you want to hear more? Okay, keep going. This is a pie chart from a Mayo Clinic study on pediatric POTS. They sent a survey to everyone who had been through their pediatric program in the last few years. And the average patient had been there 5 years earlier, and they were now getting the survey in their early 20s. And 19.2% of them reported that their symptoms were completely resolved. Their POTS was gone. 51% reported improvement, but they still had symptoms. About 15% called it relapsing remitting, which kind of comes from the MS terminology. People with MS have relapsing remitting MS. And we see patients use this term on Facebook all the time. It was the first time a researcher used it. And we're like, oh, we like that, because some people have POTS that seems to go away, and then something happens, they get a cold and it comes back for 6 months, and then it kind of goes away slowly, and then they get in a car accident and they're sick for 2 years, and then it kind of goes away. And so that's the sort of remitting, relapsing POTS. 9% said their symptoms were about the same from the time they had been diagnosed, and 3.5% said their symptoms had gotten worse. So overall, about, I think, 86% had seen some sort of improvement. So that's pretty good. That's not 86% being cured, but I do think as patients learn to cope with their symptoms, they find out what treatments work the best for their individual needs, then a lot of people do get, better. Not necessarily better, like normal better, but a better quality of life. It's just more info in the Mayo study. So quickly, I just included a few slides at the end on the treatment of POTS, in case there was anyone here who's sort of newly diagnosed and doesn't really know where to begin. Probably the most important thing is increasing salt and fluids. It sounds really boring, but it really, really helps most patients. And it's really an excessive amount of salt, not just like sprinkle a little more on your mashed potatoes. Like, you can't have too much salt. Fluids, 2 to 3 liters a day of hydrating fluids. Soda doesn't count. Try to avoid really sugary things because that can actually kind of trigger some autonomic stuff. A lot of POTS patients will overdo it on drinking the water and not get enough salt. And actually what they do is they're washing their electrolytes out and making themselves feel even sicker. So if you're chugging more water, make sure you're getting more salt too. Medical compression stockings, kind of hard to wear on a 100-degree day like today, but they do help. The ideal ones for POTS patients are the full-length compression stockings that kind of look like pantyhose. They come in all different colors. For the male patients, there are black ones that kind of look like athletic stockings, like you're going to the gym. They have open toe ones that I really like those because then your feet can breathe and it's like a little cooler. You don't feel so restricted in them. Some people get bothered when they wear them up to their stomach because they get like reflux from it if it's too tight. But interestingly, a lot of the blood pooling that does occur in POTS happens in the GI tract area, not necessarily just the legs. So if you're wearing the thigh-high ones, you're not going to get the benefit of the abdominal compression. Abdominal binders are recommended. I honestly know like 3 POTS patients who wear them. I don't know anyone else who likes them. They hurt and they're kind of clunky. Although now that like those waist training things are kind of trendy, like Kim Kardashian's walking around with that thing on, like you can actually find these in the stores now. Recumbent exercises. These are exercises that are low to the ground and not standing upright. Like jogging on a treadmill is probably not the way to start your POTS exercise plan. Starting low. Good sleep habits, you know, that applies to everyone. But if your sleep cycle is not good, your autonomic system will be off balance, even if you're a healthy person. So when you already have dysautonomia, it's really, really important to get good sleep. If you think you're having sleep problems, see a sleep specialist or talk to a doctor who can help you figure out what's wrong with your sleep pattern and try to fix it. Healthy diet goes without saying. You know, what constitutes a healthy diet for a dysautonomia patient is probably really individualized, but a lot of patients overall report that eating like an anti-inflammatory diet, a lot of healthy vegetables, leafy greens, meats, and trying to avoid like refined flours and sugars. And some people go gluten-free or dairy-free. But if you have gastroparesis, it can be really hard to eat those things because they can be a little rough on your digestion. So it has to be individualized. And if you're having nutrition problems, your body will never heal. You'll never get better. So, you know, work with your doctor, work with a nutritionist if you have to. Cooling vests can be helpful. Today is definitely the kind of day when I wish we all had them. Even if you don't have dysautonomia, it'd be nice to have one today. Avoiding triggers like heat, prolonged standing in line, hot showers, and alcohol. I actually still get pretty lightheaded after hot showers, but I've used this to help myself go to sleep at night. So instead of taking my shower in the morning, I usually take it at night and just get myself all lightheaded and dizzy before bed and then just lay down and go to sleep. Kind of use your disability to your advantage. And then learning about your illness and learning how POTS works and what's going on as much as we know about it to date, I think really helps patients manage their symptoms better. And it also takes away the fear of the unknown. Because I know when I was first diagnosed with this, I was really terrified. I felt like I was dying and nobody could tell me why. It was so scary. And the good news is people don't die from POTS. People have POTS and die from other things, but there's no increased risk of mortality ever documented in POTS. So sort of help reducing the fear of the unknown might help improve your symptom management. Just a little more on exercise. If you have EDS, obviously you have to be a little careful with the exercise. You don't want to worsen your joint issues. So work with a physical therapist or your doctor to kind of come up with a plan that's good for you. I would say swimming is probably hands down the best exercise for POTS. It keeps you cool, so when you have your heat intolerance, at least you're already in the water, as long as you're not in too hot of a water. If you're fainting, you're going to want to do it with a buddy. Make sure you don't, faint in the pool, but you're pretty unlikely to faint in the pool because it acts like a giant compression stocking. The water pressure pushes your blood back up to your heart. Lots of floor exercises to tone your legs and your core, and then rowing. Rowing is great because of all the different types of athletes in the world, rowers tend to have the strongest hearts. So that's why they recommend that for POTS patients. Pharmacological treatment. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to go really in depth in this, but there are a lot of things that can be done. The standard treatments for POTS are, beta blockers, Florinef, and midodrine. But there are a lot of other things, and if you've tried those and they didn't work for you, you're not alone, because a lot of patients try these things and they give them weird side effects. They can't take the drugs. We don't know why, but these patients are very sensitive to different drugs, and probably because drugs are studied on people with normal autonomic nervous systems, and these patients they're wired a little different, and a lot of them have sort of allergic tendencies. If a mast cell issue is present, treating that can really help a lot with the POTS symptoms. Thank you very much for your time. Okay. Hi. Do you want me to stay up here or do you want me to sit?
No, I was going to say, if there are any questions, I can pass around the microphone just so everyone can hear the questions, and the people who are viewing the presentation from outside can also hear them better that way. Yeah. Let me turn on their microphones.
While you're doing that, I have one quick question from someone from home. This is from Dr. T. You're probably best able to answer this. This is from Renee. And he said, will there be a time for discussion of EDS today besides POTS? I heard at start of POTS lecture that there is a Long Island EDS clinic, and I'm anxious to know more.
That's your question.
So I'm happy to talk about that briefly. Right, we do have a program for EDS treatment here at NYIT through the academic healthcare centers in Central Islip and in Old Westbury, where we have healthcare professionals in a number of different areas that have gained some experience working with EDS patients. They represent specialties such as genetics, myself, neurology, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, psychology, and we also have one of our physiatrists who is the dean of the medical school. He's going to be returning to practice, so he'll also be seeing patients 1 day a week, hopefully. We're bringing on a genetic counselor in the fall, and we're hoping to bring on a specialist in one area. We're not sure which one, but we're targeting things like possibly allergy immunology or rheumatology at this point. So, we're looking to grow and improve the services we have here, but any patients with EDS or who are suspected of having EDS are certainly welcome to come to the clinic. And our coordinator is Susan Christie, and she can be reached through the healthcare centers, and the number is available online. So, no.
Is there going to be a website soon, hopefully? I want to refer people, but there's no like central location.
Okay.
Yeah, when I tried to find you, it was like, you're a teacher. It's like, I'm a student.
Well,
Repeat the question so the people at home can hear.
the question was, is there a website? And there's a website for the healthcare centers, and it's called the Ryland Healthcare Center. And through that website, there's a link to the EDS treatment program, but it's a very bare bones. We're working on improving that as well.
Any other questions? Sure.
Back to the
I mentioned earlier the intolerance to exercise. The person who I know has this problem, she gets this heaviness in her head, almost like she's going to faint. Is there any specific thing that you can think of against that?
So probably there are a lot of different things you can do, and it's hard to know because first of all, I'm not a doctor, right? And I can't give specific medical advice, but in general, you want to make sure you're increasing your blood volume as much as you can with oral salt and fluids, maybe Florinef. Wearing those compression stockings, because that feeling of shortness of breath and the stabbing chest pains you might get when you try to exercise and kind of a lightheaded feeling is because you're not getting enough blood flow to the upper half of your body. So anything you can do to squeeze your blood vessels and fill them up with as much blood as possible would help. Also, doing your exercise reclined should definitely help. And it might take 6 months of reclined exercise before someone can really legitimately upright. It should be a slow transition. On our website, we have, there was a guy in Texas who did this POTS exercise protocol. They call the Levine protocol. His name is Dr. Ben Levine.
Levine protocol.
Workout protocol, and it's some patients can do it and some patients can't because it's too much. So Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has a pediatric POTS clinic, and they modified the Levine protocol to make it a little bit more doable. And we put that on our website. They gave it to us. And so if you want to check that out, it's dysautonomiainternational.org, and go to the Learn More tab, and then go to, I don't know, you'll have to find it. It's just Google exercise and POTS and dysautonomia, and it should come up. It gives specific examples of reclined exercises that should help. So yeah, but that is a big problem. But the more you exercise, the better it will be to do more exercise in the future. And I'd have to say, if you're just starting out an exercise program for POTS, you're going to feel like crap for 3 months. Like, that's pretty much the rule. But if you can keep going through that and just, eventually you kind of get to this place where you're not going to feel that way, hopefully.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Why does sugar affect us so much? Because I once ate a donut and almost fainted.
I don't have the total answer on that, but Vanderbilt, I was literally on the phone with them yesterday talking about a research study that's trying to look at how carbohydrates impact dysautonomia patients. And really in anyone, your blood sugar plays a pretty big role in your blood vessel constriction and dilation, and also you're drawing blood to your stomach to digest things, and some food might do that more than other foods. So generally a low carb diet, or always eating some protein when you eat carbs, and trying to stay away from donuts is probably a good idea. Thanks.
Hi, all right. So with the exercising, I know you harped on swimming and pool. I noticed a few years into my POTS that anytime I went in the water up to my chest, I would have issues with chest tightness, breathing in the pool. So anytime, I'd be good up to my stomach, but anytime I got up to my chest, I'd have issues with that. I'm a very thin guy. I kind of just blamed it on that, I don't have a lot of muscle mass and around me or body mass. And when I mention it to people, they're just like, oh, you're thin, your chest wall is maybe not as strong as the average. I don't know. But my question to you is that because of POTS? And if so, why?
I don't think anybody would have a good answer to that, because that's something that's not really commonly discussed. But I tell you, I notice the same thing when I go in the pool since I'm a kid. Okay. But I also know another possible reason could be, besides a blood pressure, blood flow thing, POTS patients are very, very attuned to their physical stimuli. Like I don't know about you, but me, if I get like a little bug bite on my toe, it literally feels like something just bit off my toe. Like I go, like a hypersensitivity.
Bug bite from Colorado.
So that chest tightness you might feel might just be a normal sensation that nobody else's brain processes that, because they don't have that high perception of all their stimuli. But that is just my guess. I have no idea.
I think I have very high perception too.
You could be onto something that's a big research thing. I have no idea.
Sure.
Oh, I think so too.
To be honest with you, I try not to even swim and exercise like in the pool because of that. And it's
almost the shallow end. You walk in the shallow end.
Yeah.
I've been doing myself, and I'm very close one-on-one doing lots of physical therapy.
Just walking in the pool.
One, it could be that you actually have an allergy to chlorine, because that was my issue. And then when we swapped it out for a saltwater pool, we it cost like a couple $1,000s, but totally worth it. That tended to go away. Also, if you have EDS and POTS, you have to be really careful about swimming because of alignment, and you're like even kicking. So what I do is just like straight water walking. I just walk, because even swimming can throw off your alignment in your hips and your legs. And that's actually brought up on your web. Thank you so much for posting that.
The relaxicity, I bet you the bottom of my hips.
It's really great. So thank you.
Walking probably would be.
Is there anyone at home that has a question?
I don't know how to check the home questions.
They're unmuted, so they can just talk.
Anybody at home want to chime in?
Can you hear us at home? Nobody's home.
Okay, well, we have another question in the audience.
I'm wondering how we can help. So a couple of things is mitadrine or midodrine. Is that still on the chopping block? And are you trying to get a petition? And anybody from NYIT, if we could rally up some medical students, that might be very helpful. We could get a few hundred or a few thousand perhaps to sign for that. And any fundraising.
So I still can't get a clear answer on how to pronounce midodrine. I actually talked to the guy who got it FDA approved in the first place, and he says both is correct. Everybody, depending on which part of the country, uses a different way to pronounce it. I say midodrine. So what's going on with that, for those who don't know, is it was approved by the FDA in 1996 under the Rare Disease Accelerated Drug Approval Program. And as a condition of the approval, the drug company, Shire, had to submit post-marketing data, meaning after they started selling it, post-marketing data demonstrating that the drug actually worked beyond 2 weeks, because the initial approval was based on 2-week efficacy data. So they never did that, or they did it, but they didn't do it to FDA satisfaction. Then sort of nothing happened for a long time. And then in 2010, I think, FDA sort of woke up from its regulatory slumber and said, oh, we're going to pull that drug off the market. They never did the studies they were supposed to do. And unfortunately, Shire was no longer making the drug. It had gone off patent, and so they stopped making it when it stopped making them all their money. And it's made by cheap generics now overseas. So Shire could care less if it's taken off the market. They don't make the drug anymore. But the approval for the drug is based on their initial approval. So what happened, there was a big outcry from the patient community. Then Shire agreed to do the study, but of course had no incentive to spend any money and do a really good study. So they did a study. It actually just published within the past month, one of the 2 studies they did, and it did show efficacy. So the FDA had threatened to pull the drug. They put that on hold while they waited for Shire to do the study they should have done 10 years ago. And it's kind of working its way through the process. So the problem is that if the other study doesn't come out good, or if FDA's advisory committee decides that study isn't good enough, they could still pull the drug. So we started rallying the troops in preparation, because we know that so many people, 1 million people per year, fill prescriptions for midodrine. It is a hugely important drug, and there really is nothing else like it. So we started a petition. Some of our board members met with the FDA senior staff on this a couple times. Like once a year we go meet them. And
can you keep it more as a 5 then?
Someone's talking from home, I think. So we have a petition that has over 8,000 signatures on it. We would love more signatures. I can send that to you, and if you want to distribute it, that would be great.
Do you want that now, or at the time that the FDA is?
So we're collecting them now, and when the FDA has its hearing, which we've been waiting for over a year, we are going to bring that petition and every single signature. And we actually, after the signature line, we let patients put their own personal comments. So in addition to your signature on a petition that everyone agrees on, we left room for people to sort of provide their own personal experience and and you don't have to be a patient. You could be a parent, a medical provider, a concerned neighbor, because the FDA needs to hear that we're not going to let them take this drug away without a fight, because it's too important to our patients. In terms of fundraising, Dysautonomia International is always fundraising, like every nonprofit. The vast majority of our funding goes directly to funding POTS research. We are interested in other autonomic disorders too, but for research purposes, we've decided to focus on POTS for now, because we think we can actually make a really big difference. And we definitely have in the 5 years we've been around. And I can't wait to see, the result of all the investments we've made when these things start publishing, and it trickles down to the local clinician actually reading this and saying, wow, this is real, So yeah, we're always fundraising for that. We also do physician education courses around the country, and that takes money to hold a course for the doctors. And not just doctors, we want to do nurse education, NPs, PAs. So if any of you have contacts at the hospitals in the New York area, we'd love to do grand rounds. And we bring in outside experts, somebody like Dr. Shamali or Dr. Grubb or somebody from Mayo, and get them to teach the doctors. That's really how we're going to change this for the patients in the future, and for ourselves, current patients who have this kind of stuff. And we always talk about EDS when we educate on autonomic disorders, even though EDS itself is not an autonomic disorder. We always include a mention of EDS and the basics, so that they're at least aware of it if a patient comes to them and says, by the way, I have this thing called EDS, because it's important for them to get that. another way to get involved is October is Dysautonomia Awareness Month. In the New York area, we are lighting up the Helmsley Tower on Park Avenue in New York City. Is going to be turquoise for the second year in a row. That's the giant building on top of on top of Grand Central Station. So we have an event October 21st in New York City, if anybody wants to come out to that. We also are lighting up Niagara Falls on October 1st, if you really feel like taking a drive north and hanging out in the cold to look at the falls. Today, it would be really nice to be in that cold weather. And there's going to be hundreds of events around the world. Last year, we had over 100 events in 3 different countries. And this year, we're aiming for 5 countries and something in all 50 states. So that's it. Oh, sure.
Sort of multifaceted. I may have missed this, but I was wondering what % of POTS patients are identified or diagnosed? Yeah. Okay. Are diagnosed with EDS. How many POTS patients are probably undiagnosed with EDS?
Right. So that's a good question. There's now probably 4 different studies saying that it's about 1/3 of patients who have EDS. And some of those studies were online surveys where you would expect that there are some missing people who haven't been diagnosed. But there's also inpatient studies at the big specialty centers, people who know how to diagnose EDS, who actively screened each of their patients and found it was about 1/3. So it seems like, I think probably because of the awareness within the patient community, patients talk about it so much. If you're connected in with that patient community and you have EDS, you probably will get diagnosed eventually. You just probably have to find the doctor in your area that gets it. So it's about 1/3. In terms of how many EDS patients have POTS, we don't really have data on that. But when I went to the international EDS research meeting that the Ehlers-Danlos Society put on, you know, I was surprised. I thought that they would be talking about like joint issues the whole time. A lot of the discussion. So many of us have not just POTS, but other forms of dysautonomia as well, and that this is almost worse or just as bad as the joint issues. So that was educational for me, because I kind of had in my mind assuming that the joint stuff was much worse. But I guess it depends on the patient too.
He'll pick up at 5.
Just so everybody at home knows, we unmuted you, so if anybody has questions, we should ask, and if not, if you could just be quiet.
I do have a question.
And we'll turn the mics off.
Hello, I do have a question.
Great.
Good, this is Vicki.
Hi.
Hi, I'm from Indiana. I'm going through a lot of testing, just trying to get this EDS and dysautonomia. I'm working with Cleveland Clinic. I was wondering, am I going to the right place, or should I have gone to Mayo Clinic, or any suggestions?
Cleveland Clinic has some good dysautonomia doctors that should know how to diagnose EDS too. And at any of the bigger centers, it really depends on who you see, right? Because Mayo Clinic is a huge place, and I'm sure there's doctors at Mayo Clinic that have no idea what dysautonomia is. And then on the other hand, they have, you know, one of the world's best autonomic neurology labs. So it probably depends on who you're seeing. But I think in general, Cleveland Clinic is pretty good. I'm from New York, and I went to Cleveland Clinic and they diagnosed my Sjogren's. So I give them thumbs up.
Okay. I'm seeming to have some problems with them up there, though, really getting to do this hyperadrenergic kind of symptoms that I'm having and getting really a diagnosis from them. So I'm getting sort of frustrated.
Yeah, I think that being frustrated with our doctors is a universal experience of dysautonomia and EDS patients.
Right.
Are there many doctors you'd recommend within that clinic?
Anybody, yeah.
I know Dr. Yeager has some interest in POTS. He's one of the guys I saw out there. Dr. I think Robert Wilson. In pediatrics, there's a guy, Dr. Moody. You don't sound pediatric, but for people who are listening at home. So yeah, somebody in I think it's the Heart and Vascular Institute that they have there.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Oh, also, anybody who wants to can go on Dysautonomia International's website. If you click on the map at the top of our website, you can search for doctors, and we have a list. It's not every single doctor who does dysautonomia, but it's a lot of the top specialists are on there. So there are not too many of them, so you might have to drive far. A question up here, sure.
Just following up to that, how important would it be for a POTS patient to get an actual diagnosis of EDS we would suspect it. We'd be told it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You've got it.
So I disagree. I think it matters to the patient and it matters to your family. It matters to, if you have children, you're going to want to know this. It matters if you have surgery. I mean, probably people in this room are better qualified to answer that question than me, but it definitely matters. In fact, Peter Rowe at Hopkins, who was the first researcher to describe the link between EDS and orthostatic intolerance, I asked him to present on this at our conference last month to the other doctors, because there are plenty of dysautonomia experts who think EDS you don't need to diagnose it. And while it may not dramatically change the outcome or the treatment, I think that patients have a right to know what's going on with their body, and it might be really relevant. What if we find out that you know, there's this marker for EDS and we can somehow treat it differently? You'd want to know. You wouldn't want to miss that opportunity to diagnose something. So I say, yes, you want to get diagnosed. Yeah.
If you are, how many of us started off doing yoga
Right.
to improve the pain, going to chiropractors, and we all, did a disservice to our bodies by
Right.
making it worse. So if you don't have that knowledge moving forward, you could really do
Right.
damage. You need to educate yourself and every healthcare professional you interact with in the future. It's very important to know this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it frustrates me that there are experts who think it's not so important. But I think that statement to a patient, it comes from a place of ignorance. They don't understand what EDS is or why it's relevant. So that's our job, to educate them, and hopefully over time that will change. Sure.
Hi. I'm interested in what you said earlier about the connection between dysautonomia and autoimmune diseases, particularly celiac disease. It's been a 6-year journey for us, and I thought our journey was over when my daughter was diagnosed with celiac disease, but it wasn't, because the pain continued, and she was just diagnosed with EDS last month. And I'm just wondering, am I at the end of my journey, or should I really look into more dysautonomia, and who would I go to for that?
So you're from Long Island?
Yes.
I'd say Dr. Tige here, they certainly know about
he diagnosed her last month.
Okay. They certainly know about dysautonomia here. And if they think that, she would need more additional testing, there are places that you could go for that. But really, I would say the dysautonomia, is this dysautonomia question comes up, like, does someone have lightheadedness and fainting and really profound fatigue and GI motility problems, which you might have with celiac by itself. But not everyone who has EDS has dysautonomia, and not everyone with celiac has autonomic neuropathy. So it's kind of hard to say, at the individual level without being a doctor, and I'm not. But something to be aware of, read the symptoms on our website, and if you have enough of those symptoms, maybe ask for a follow-up on that.
Thank you.
So when looking for resources on your website, you said you can press the thing, find your doctors. Are they just literally alphabetical? Do you have them ranked?
So they're listed 2 different ways. And we're actually in the process of doing a really big website overhaul, because our website, we made it ourselves in 2012. My husband was our slave labor to make us our website. And so we have actual web consultants doing a really good modern redesign. Everything will be relocated and hopefully easier to find. But right now you can find them on the map, which will just be geographically, like you just have to click on the dot and see what doctor or what center. Right. Nope. 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 Yeah, but there's also, if you go to Connect, you go to Connect and then find a doctor, they're listed geographically, like by state. So it's not a very long list. We're very fussy about who we add to the list, because sometimes patients will say, well, why don't you have Dr. So-and-so? I saw him and he's great. But if he doesn't have a way to do autonomic testing, if he's not really, specializing in this, there are a lot of doctors who know what dysautonomia is, but they're not experts in it. So that's, yeah. Some of them are better than others, but we do list them because people who live in the middle of nowhere need somewhere to go. Not everybody, if we can't have all million of us going to Mayo Clinic, So, okay.
I have another question here from online.
Oh, okay.
Vicki, I lost my entered some of your presentation, unfortunately. You said you're recording this. Where can I look at the whole presentation again? Where is that going to be located at? On the Dysautonomia International website? Will this be on here?
If I guess you have to talk to MIT about how we're going to get it off of their Zoom thing, but if I'm able to, I'm going to post it on longislandeds.com.
Right.
So with MIT's permission.
On which website again? Say that again, please.
longislandeds.com.
And we can post a link on the Dysautonomia International Facebook page so people can see it.
That'll be great. All right,
Assuming
thank
I
you.
did good in the lecture.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we had a question up here. Sorry about that.
Can you talk a little more about the adrenergic receptor antibodies? What besides the symptoms that we've heard about is associated with them?
Oh my goodness. So adrenergic receptors are all over your body. They do so much stuff. It could be a whole medical school course in itself. They're in your brain, they're in your heart, they're in your kidney, they're in your liver, they're in your blood vessels, they're in your GI tract. I mean, they're really the root of your sympathetic nervous system is those receptors. So just to kind of give a hypothetical, or actually I don't have to give a hypothetical. Dr. Kem took, they purified the IgG of POTS patients. IgG is where your autoimmune antibodies would be if you had them. So they purified IgG from POTS patient blood, and they dripped it on an artery from a lab rat. Sorry, I don't want to offend anyone, but there is animal research that happens in autoimmune research, and the blood vessel would either constrict or not constrict based on the type of receptor and the type of antibody. The same thing with GI smooth muscle. So the GI tract is, let me back up. An easier way of explaining it is the autonomic nervous system feeds the smooth muscles of your body, the cardiovasculature, the GI muscles, the pupils. So anywhere you have that smooth muscle, you have these adrenergic receptors. So if those antibodies are blocking the receptor, or they're actually cranking the receptor up to work a little bit more, antibodies can do different things. And they're actually finding that in the research. Some of the antibodies are sort of blocking the message, and then other antibodies seem to be amping up the message. So that could be part of why these patients have sort of diverse symptom presentations. Someone might have too fast GI tract, someone might have a too slow GI tract. So there's a lot of things. The adrenergic receptors are even on mast cells. So I was chatting up Dr. Afreen about this at our conference last month. I was like, did you know that we have these antibodies we're finding, and these receptors are on your mast cells that you're studying? So I wonder, totally just a wonder at this point, could those antibodies be doing something to the mast cell receptors and sort of priming those mast cells to set off at the drop of a hat, which seems to happen in some of these patients. So, sure.
Just to follow up on mast cell, a couple questions. Suggesting the research or suggesting the things that have been said, how POTS, EDS, and mast cell seems to suggest a lot of overlap with somebody who has POTS and EDS. Is it a necessary thing to be screened for?
That's probably more of a question for your specific doctor, who I happen to know.
Yeah.
But I think in general, I wouldn't pursue the mast cell testing unless you have symptoms really suggesting it. You have a lot of allergic-like reactions. Do you get hives? Do you get sort of random itchy flushing? Some of the mast cell symptoms can be like after you eat something, suddenly you might get horrific diarrhea, or a sudden drop in your blood pressure. These are sort of mast cell-like symptoms. But it's really hard to know with POTS, because there are so many things that could be contributing, and you don't want to go on this expensive wild goose chase testing for a million things.
And my follow-up question with that, with testing, do you have to be tested during an attack for something like that to appear on whatever the test?
There's different types of tests, and I'm not like a super mast cell expert. We do have an article on our website on the blog written by a mast cell immunologist on the different types of tests you can have done. Some of the tests you have to have done within a 4-hour window. Some of the tests you have to have done within a 24-hour collection of urine collection for urine methylhistamine. It really depends on the test.
You spoke about small fiber neuropathy, and I don't think that most of us quite understand what that is and what the testing is and where that would be done and if that's important.
Okay, so really breaking down the nervous system into rudimentary parts. You have your brain and your spinal cord, which are your central nervous system. And then outside of that, you have large fiber nerves that are that go from the spinal cord to the thing that they're trying to give nerve messages to. And then you have small fiber nerves that are in the skin and are in the GI tract. You have small fiber nerves in a lot of places. Usually, when we talk about small fiber nerves, we're talking about the lower legs and the feet. Because a lot of people with small fiber neuropathy associate it with the painful small fiber neuropathy seen usually in diabetes. But you can actually have a loss of small fiber sensory nerves and not have pain. So I'd be one of those patients. I don't know why it doesn't hurt. I'm very glad it doesn't hurt. But so the way that doctors test for neuropathy, generally a typical neurologist will do an EMG or nerve conduction study, and that looks at the large fiber nerves. And if that's normal, they'll say, you don't have neuropathy. That's the average neurologist. That's what they'll tell you. If you go to a doctor that sort of knows more about this stuff, and small fiber neuropathy isn't just a POTS problem, it's a lot of different diseases that have this. They would do other things. They would do possibly a skin biopsy. It's a little tiny 3 millimeter poke in your leg that looks at the density of your small fiber nerves. And they can distinguish between sensory and autonomic small fibers. You could have a Q-SART test, sometimes called Q-SWEAT. It's a test that was invented by Mayo Clinic, and they look at the way that your body responds to a mild electrical stimulation and acetylcholine to see how you sweat. If you don't sweat a certain amount, then they know that you have a problem with your autonomic nerves in your legs, at least in that spot that they tested. There's also a test called the thermoregulatory sweat test, which is really only done at the big centers like Mayo, and Dr. Shamali has one down at Eastern Virginia Medical School. I don't even know if Vanderbilt has one, but this is really just done when you get the big autonomic workup. And they put this powder over the front of your body called azithrin red. It's actually the same powder that they stamp USDA on the beef. So you kind of feel like a big hunk of beef after you have this test. And if you sweat, your skin turns this dreadful dark purple color. And if you don't sweat, it doesn't change color. So I had the test done at Cleveland Clinic, and you literally walk out like just looking like you have a horrible disease, like this purple blotch all over you, and it doesn't come off for like a day.
So you highly recommend it.
Oh, and the best part is at Cleveland Clinic, they give you a Tyvek paper bikini, and because you need something to cover yourself, and it's Tyvek, so it doesn't stain like fabric. And it was houndstooth print. I was like, wow, like Cleveland Clinic springing for the fashion statement in the bikini. But that can tell you if a person has segmental autonomic dysfunction. They might have like this part of their body's normal and this part isn't, which can kind of indicate where an autonomic nerve fiber lesion might be. But yeah, there's different ways to test for it, and not too many places that know how to do that.
Does it change the treatment? So is it important to get tested?
I would argue that it is important to know that, because it's a concrete thing. Like, to have neuropathy, that sort of validates your diagnosis is a real thing. And there, even though EDS and POTS are a real thing too, a lot of doctors don't think they are, or they think it's not such a big deal. But when you can say, yes, I have neuropathy. Also, if you have a neuropathy, you should see a neurologist to have a workup to look for the causes of neuropathy. There are common things that we know cause neuropathy, and you should rule them out. Make sure you don't have something treatable like a diabetes or Sjogren's or lupus or something like that. Okay.
I know you mentioned alcohol in the slides and then also sugar later on, but does caffeine give an adverse effect on POTS?
So some POTS patients feel better from caffeine, especially migraine patients. But caffeine tends to stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. So it's going to give you more tachycardia, possibly, more of your POTS-y kind of symptoms. It's really up to the individual to figure it out. Drink a soda, tell me how you feel. But I stay away from it. I can't have any of that stuff. Are we?
or two questions, but I'm sure
I think we're going to wrap
joint
up
mouth
eventually.
must be
Yeah.
quite-
My family went to the beach without me, so I'm here for the day. They went surfing. No. So, okay, do you want to just take one or two more?
Are there specific electrolyte doses for POTS patients versus normal patients or dehydrated patients on your website? I can look at it. And my second question, if electrolyte water doesn't work for the day, the next step, would you think, is the mineralocorticoid?
I think that's really an individual basis kind of thing that a doctor has to decide. But yeah, most doctors would do the non-pharmacological stuff first and then move on to medication. In terms of a specific, POTS mix, it's as much salt as you can get in, and then you do want some potassium as well. A lot of these patients, if you're on Florinef, your potassium can actually drop, so you should be monitoring that. We're very lucky to have two recent corporate sponsors who have developed dysautonomia specific products with the input from our advisory board and some of the doctors we work with, and input from patients on what they wanted in an electrolyte product. So we have an oral hydration product called Normalite Pure, and it has like no flavorings or added like it has a little dextrose because your body needs sugar to absorb the sodium better. But it's just a touch of sugar, it's not a lot. And so anyways, I'm mentioning them because that was formulated with patient and physician input for dysautonomia patients. But there are probably other products, that do something similar, like oral hydration salts. Also, a company called SaltStick makes these salt pills, and they made some specific for dysautonomia patients called SaltStick Vitasium, because it has a little extra potassium in it too. And both of those companies agreed to donate 10% of their sales to Dysautonomia International, which we're really excited about because it's products that are meant for our patients, and we're going to take that money and invest it in research. You can go on our Facebook page. We actually just sort of announced it in the past month, and we're going to have links on our website. And we have an Amazon store on our website, which if you shop through our Amazon link to any item on Amazon, they will give 6% to Dysautonomia International. So we ask people, do your Christmas shopping and Hanukkah shopping through our website. Okay, do we have...
Lauren in our backyard to be able to have this time with her to answer all these questions. So we thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad. I really think it's so important to build bridges between the dysautonomia and the EDS world, because we're all in the same boat, and we need to row as much as we can to get out of the water.
And thanks, Dr. Tige and
yes, thank you
NYIT
so
for
much.
hosting us, and Long Island EDS for making it happen. So hooray.
We're just going to stop the recording here and give it time to consolidate. And then if you have a USB drive, we can transfer it over there for you. Okay.